nestled between California's Mount Wilson and Mount Baldy. At the base of the San Gabriel Mountains lies a valley with rich soil, a rich history, and very rich businessmen. The San Gabriel Valley is located 30 miles east of Los Angeles. In the 1800s, when the area was known as Rancho La Puente, most of the land belonged to the original settlers, William Workman and John Rowland. Other neighboring landowners were celebrities in their own right. Don Pio Pico, the last governor of Mexican California, and a fancy San Francisco businessman, Elias J. Lucky Baldwin. By 1952, the area was best known for its citrus exports, walnut groves, and cattle crossings. Back then, the southeast portion of the San Gabriel Valley was known as North Whittier Heights, before eventually changing its name to Hacienda Heights in 1961. Turnbull Canyon is a small canyon with a narrow, windy road that divides the communities of Hacienda Heights and Whittier. The canyon itself has become infamous with locals for its mysterious stories, myths, and urban legends. Some of those stories include Indian war massacres dating back to the 1600s, kidnapped orphans, the burning down of a mental asylum, satanic cults, hanging trees, and even the gates to hell. Today we're going to focus on a mystery in the canyon that most folks don't even know really happened. The crash of Flight 416 West on April 18, 1952. When looking into this mysterious crash on the internet, you'll come across a lot of conspiracy theories such as there were no identifying numbers on the plane, most of the passengers were stolen children from Area 51, and there were no published reports of this crash anywhere. Some even believe the canyon itself craved the blood of the innocent and somehow forced the plane to crash. Well, none of this is true. Airline travel was different in the early 50s. A lot of pilots were now returning veterans and eager to continue flying. So they formed their own airlines. These airlines operated on a non-scheduled basis. They began offering the first discount fares. These non-scheduled airlines, or non-skeds, carried cargo and passengers on an irregular or charter basis. And by combining their resources, such as renting planes or runways, some non-skeds were able to offer transcontinental services at a discounted fare. This forced other airlines to price match. And with the widespread availability of surplus Curtiss C-46 transport planes after World War II, many freight service airlines such as Flying Tigers, Seaboard World, and Robin Airlines arose and usually prospered. In 1952, Robin Airlines, owned by Charles A. Rector, was a company on the brink of disaster. In 1951, one of its airlines crashed in Canada. The pilot was forced to carry out a wheels-up landing in a farm field near Coburg. No one was injured in this crash, but the Aeronautics Board ordered the airline to cease operations pending an investigation. But Robin Airlines was also hurting financially due to stiff competition. Bigger, more powerful airplanes were arriving on the scene with 4 engines enabling passengers to fly farther and faster. Meanwhile, Robin airliners were beginning to show their age. Ceasing operations wasn't an option. In order to continue operations, Charles Rector needed to find a loophole, so he changed the name of his airline. Now he can continue operations during the investigation. However, no authorization to change names had been given from the Civil Aeronautics Board. Nevertheless, on April 16, 1952, Reserve Captain John D. Trayer was a pilot for this new airline, North Continent Airlines. Flight 416 West left LaGuardia Airfield in New York at 6:09 p.m. en route to California. Its first stop was Chicago, then on to Kansas City, Missouri, where the plane touched down. Additional flight crew members were picked up, Captain Lewis Powell and co-pilot Charles Waldron, who was also a part-time film actor. Civil air regulations made it necessary to have a 3-man flight crew due to the long flight time. For this purpose, Reserve Captain Trayer sat in the jump seat. This is also known as deadheading. Also boarding the flight in Kansas City was 29-year-old Harriet Parmalee. a resident of Whittier, and an off-duty flight attendant who was catching a ride home. She had been staying with family in Michigan while attending the funeral of her uncle, Claude Parmalee. Claude owned a sporting goods store in Royal Oak, Michigan. One evening at his store, while he and a customer were still inside, a gas leak erupted into a massive explosion. At the time, it was considered the largest explosion in the state's history. After her uncle's funeral, Harriet was anxious to get back home to Whittier and her family. But Harriet would have to wait. Departure from Kansas City was delayed approximately 11 hours to replace the leaky right engine oil cooler. The crew may have caught up on some sleep during this wait time, though there is no official word of this. At 1:38 a.m. on April 17th, the repairs had been made, and the flight departed Kansas City with Reserve Captain Trayer now occupying the left pilot seat and co-pilot Waldron the right. Captain Powell rode deadhead. Flight 416 West stopped in Wichita, Kansas, where it refueled and quickly got back in the air. As they flew over New Mexico, the plane encountered a severe thunderstorm. So Captain Trayer turned the ship eastward and landed in Amarillo, Texas to wait out the storm. At 6:14 p.m., it had been 27 hours since the plane and her passengers left New York. Everyone, including the crew, was feeling the strain of travel. At this time, Reserve Captain Trayer said goodbye to his crew for the last time and disembarked the plane. It should be noted that in this investigation, it's unclear as to why Captain Trayer chose to leave the flight at this unscheduled stop. 3 hours later, the storm had cleared, and at 9:02 p.m., Captain Powell and his C-46 lifted off the Amarillo runway and headed west. Captain Powell had been active in aviation for a number of years and had accumulated nearly 8,000 hours of flying time, and had a reputation among other pilots as a skillful and cautious airman. But just months before taking command of Flight 416 West, Captain Powell suffered a heart attack of such severity that his physician immediately sent him to a hospital by ambulance. When Captain Powell was examined just 1 month before this doomed flight, his physician was quoted as saying,
"I am sincerely sympathetic with Mr. Powell's occupational catastrophe. However, I am convinced that coronary artery disease and pilot responsibility are incompatible."
Regardless, Robin Airlines, against better judgment, permitted Captain Powell to pilot the aircraft anyway. The plane landed in Phoenix, Arizona on April 18th at 12:30 in the morning. 3 adult passengers and 1 infant exited the aircraft. It was then the final flight manifest was recorded and mailed to the airline's home office in Kansas City. After the layover, Flight 416 West left Phoenix. It was 1:43 a.m. and the flight headed for its destination, the Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank. Everything proceeded as normal when Flight 416 West crossed the Arizona-California state line at 3:13 a.m. The crew adjusted their instruments for a northwest approach and was cruising at 6,000 feet. And after 33 hours of flight time, these weary travelers were eager to get onto solid ground. As the plane flew into Riverside County airspace, a thick fog rolled in, and the temperature was a balmy 50 degrees. The bad weather was beginning to affect not only the radio, but the instruments as well. Riverside informed the crew that Burbank Airport was closed due to heavy fog. The flight would have to divert to Inglewood and the Los Angeles International Airport for its final landing. At 3:23 a.m., air traffic control gave the following clearance to the aircraft.
N04C from present position to Downey radio beacon, cruise at least 500 on top. Descend using a visual flight rules plan, cross Downey and maintain 3,000 feet. Contact Los Angeles approach control over La Habra, no delay expected.
Copy that, tower.
It was 3:33 a.m. The fog in the San Gabriel Valley had pushed its way up against Turnbull Canyon, where it concealed the hills like an enormous blanket.
Tower, this is N04C. I believe we're in the vicinity of La Habra. Over.
La Habra residents would later report being startled out of bed by an extremely loud and low-flying airplane.
We're having difficulty with our automatic direction finder due to static. I believe we'll have to make some other type of approach. Over.
N04C, do you have an instrument landing system in place? Are you able to pick up the outer marker?
Affirmative, Tower. I can probably find the ILS glide path and proceed from there on in.
Roger that, N04C. You are cleared for straight-in ILS approach from the Los Angeles outer marker. Remain at 3,000 feet until final approach.
LA Tower Control began watching for Captain Powell and his C-46 to appear on the surveillance radar. At 3:37, there was still no sign of the C-46. Several radio calls were directed to Captain Powell and his crew.
N04C, this is Tower Control. What is your location? N04C, do you copy? N04C, this is Tower Control. What is your 20?
But a response was never received.
I started rolling down that lost highway.
Just after 10 a.m. on April 18th, a rancher named Hayden Jones was driving on his Whittier Heights ranch looking for stray cattle in the dissipating morning fog. Mr. Jones noticed black smoke rising from behind one of the nearby hills. Hayden investigated, and as he climbed to the top, the first thing he noticed was a long, deep groove carved into the summit. As the rancher looked beyond the mysterious hilltop scar and into the tiny valley that was known as Squaw Gap, Mr. Jones could see the flicker of fire and a flash of steel in the morning sun. It was a large airplane, smashed and still burning while embedded into a steep hillside. The large tail assembly stood tall like a monolithic tombstone with its identification number blazoned across it. Hayden got into his truck and sped to his neighbor's house, Mr. and Mrs. Juan Echebarren, and immediately called the sheriff's department. Mrs. Echebarren was quoted as saying,
"It sounded like a bomb. It was way before daylight, and we didn't know what that noise was."
Hayden Jones's wife, Bernice, recalls,
"I was woken out of my bed around 3:30 by a loud noise. My first thought was it sounded like a plane in distress. But then I heard my daughter stirring in bed and figured that must have been what I heard."
Captain Sewell Griggers, chief of the sheriff's Aero Squadron, was first on the scene. He flew over the wreckage of the downed aircraft and confirmed the tail assembly number, N8404C, as the missing plane. Once on the ground, Griggers was quoted as saying,
"Everyone on board died on impact or in the inferno that followed."
By the time word got out to the sleeping valley below, recovery teams of both police and firemen began to scale the steep, slippery hillsides up to the impact area. Jeeps full of men carried cutting torches and cranes to the top of the hill. What awaited them brought back memories of World War II for some. The sights and smells of death and carnage. After the fire had been extinguished, the charred tail assembly was all that remained. An uncredited reporter described the feeling at the crash site that day. Meadowlarks could be heard singing nearby. Grazing cattle stared at the tragic scene, and the transport's gaunt rudder swung eerily back and forth in the gentle wind, an erratic, thumping requiem. First impact was on the north side of the hills at about 980 feet and a whisper below the crest of the ridge. The landing gear was down for the approach, and the left wheel gouged a foot deep into the soil and cut a scar 10 feet long. A split second later, the right wheel cut into the grass-covered earth and the transport shot over the crest, throwing both wheel assemblies deep into the valley and scattering chunks of its engines along an oil-strewn path of death. For half a dozen heartbeats, the ship remained in the air during its long, arcing plunge toward destruction. Then one wing smashed into the earth, and the fuselage exploded into the hillside. Investigators said, Captain Powell must have thought he was much closer to LAX than he really was. If not for the extended landing gears, the plane may have just barely made it over the hills. The plane was 10 feet too low. According to sheriff's deputies, it was difficult to tell if there was 1 or 29 bodies aboard due to the disintegrated condition of the plane. Wreckage was scattered for several acres down the 45-degree slope. Bits of torn and twisted metal were thrown down the opposite side of the hill. The impact had been so fierce that half of the passengers and fuselage were embedded into the hillside. One passenger lay 75 feet away, still strapped into his seat. The recovery team pulled what remained of the plane and its passengers out of the ground using cranes and old-fashioned elbow grease. Cutting torches freed the badly burned bodies from what was left of the crushed cylinder. Luggage, scraps of paper, and the usual things of life were strewn for yards. One investigator found a half-burned Bible. Identification couldn't be made of the passengers and crew. A representative for Robin Airlines said, "There should have been about 25 passengers and a crew of 3 aboard," but was unable to determine the exact number because the only passenger manifests were either on board the plane or in the mail on its way to the airline's home office. In the days following this horrendous crash, it was announced that one of Whittier's own was indeed a passenger on the doomed flight. Harriet Parmalee had moved to Whittier from Michigan 3 years prior with her parents Gail and Helen and her sister Sally. After losing his brother Claude and his daughter Harriet, Gail Parmalee became so distraught that his heart just couldn't take it any longer. Harriet's father died just 2 months later on July 19th of a broken heart. Both Harriet and her father were laid to rest at Rose Hill Cemetery in Whittier.
On a California hillside near Los Angeles, the wreckage of a non-scheduled C-46 airliner lies strewn over a quarter of a mile. 29, all on board, perished as the plane crashed during an early morning overcast. The craft was en route from New York to Los Angeles and was preparing for a landing at its destination less than 20 miles away. The plane skidded across the top of a 1,000-foot hill and caromed into the side of another. Investigating authorities indicated that heart failure on the part of the pilot might have been the cause of the disaster. Radio trouble was also reported as a possible cause of the crash. In a tightening up of safety regulations, the line operating the transport was ordered to suspend operations. As the wreckage yields its tragic harvest of dead, civil aeronautics authorities ponder a complete revision of air traffic laws. Another tragedy of the airlanes takes its toll.
In the end, it wasn't faulty instruments, equipment failure, or even the captain's bad heart that caused the crash. The Aeronautics Board determined that the probable cause of this accident was the action of the pilot. Captain Lewis Powell descended below 1,000 feet, hoping to see underneath and through the fog. He was far below the minimum altitude he was cleared for, and that mistake ultimately cost himself, his crew, and his passengers their lives. Several hours after the crash, the Civil Aeronautics Administration grounded Robin Airlines for over 40 violations. This accident led the Aeronautics Board to reevaluate and change their standards and air traffic laws. The irony of this story is that only 3 years prior to this accident, Captain Powell had invented an automatic navigator. This invention would enable a pilot to know his air position at a glance. This would have been particularly useful in thick fog. Captain Powell had disclosed the invention to the Air Development Navigation Board 2 years prior, but nothing had ever been done. In this sad photo, you can see Captain Powell's family holding the plans of their deceased father's invention that very well could have saved his life as well as everyone else aboard. As time moves forward, the tragic events of that day continue to fade into history. And like a generational game of telephone, the facts of this aging tale have morphed into urban legend and infamy. But as we investigate and look back, we now know there wasn't any mysterious unknown airplane that just fell out of the sky that day. Its story wasn't hushed and swept aside to conceal devious secret government plans. Nor did Turnbull Canyon crave the blood of the innocent. It was simple human error. Today, those urban legends have created a fog of their own. They've lasted a lifetime and concealed the mysteries of Flight 416 West. Getting to the bottom of a story or myth can be an adventure in itself. If you have a mystery you would like to solve, I suggest you find out for yourself. Discover the information you're looking for at your local library today.